Our theme this month, July, is freedom and justice. And on the 4th of July, we in the United States, we offer gratitude for a country that is diverse. We continue to evolve and progress. Slowly, the struggle continues and creeps towards more inclusion, acceptance, and fairness. And along the way, we experience the many pains of growth. And in this frame, I do feel proud. I do feel proud to be part of this collective experiment. But my pride gets tempered when I take a step back and objectively reflect. To be unvarnished and truthful, I end up hunching over a bit in knowing that the original idealistic vision for America was reserved for a select few male landowners. And I remember that this initially narrow vision came into being and grew through violence and warfare. The rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air. Now, that initially narrow vision used brutality, genocide, and enslavement to expand the power of the few. With manifest destiny and westward expansion, the few gained more and more power, more and more wealth, more and more resources, and these select few winners wrote the history and built the institutions that hold and teach a slanted version of events. And the select few developed curriculum to support the perspectives of their side, the winning side. And among the losers are our native and indigenous siblings, forcibly removed from centuries-old homelands and stripped of sacred ritual, religion, language, food, communal sufficiency, and community itself. Our siblings from Africa were enslaved and treated and regarded as property, as less than. And the children of the enslaved were not allowed to be children, but were the property of the slaveholder, who then demanded of the birth givers to raise the slaveholder property, not to become their fullest beings, but for the task of raising and training property to become another unit of labor and production. And then with waves of immigration from certain parts of Europe who were brought over to feed the machine of industrialization, they too gave up ancestral names, culture, and faith to belong. Now, this dynamic has reigned in supreme perpetuity, and yet all along there have been serious threats to its dominance, social justice movements, wokeness, basic decency. These threats towards inclusion and basic decency have been met with vicious resistance and violent responses in streets, and far more dangerously, in legislatures and courtrooms all over this land. Now, this dynamic, this system, in my understanding, is, quote, the fantastic hegemonic imagination. It's kind of a big phrase. I'll say it again. The fantastic hegemonic imagination. Professor Emily M. Towns coined the phrase in her book, Womanist Ethics and the Cultural Production of Evil. Dr. Towns, in addition to her many books, is dean of the Divinity School at Vanderbilt University, is the chair of Ethics and Society, is Distinguished Professor of Womanist Ethics and Society, Professor of Gender and Sexuality Director, and Public Theology and Racial Justice. So when Dr. Towns speaks, I listen. And Dr. Towns explains fantastic hegemonic imagination. I'm going to try to read it kind of slow. Hang in there with me, you'll get it. The set of ideas that dominant groups employ in a society to secure the consent of subordinates to abide by their rule, the notion of consent is key because hegemony is created through coercion that is gained using the church, family, media, political parties, schools, unions, and other voluntary associations, the civil society and all its organization. This breeds a kind of false consciousness, the fantastic in neo-cultural and social-political drag that creates societal values and moralities such that there is one coherent and accurate viewpoint in the world, end quote. That's a lot. That's a lot to take in, but basically she's explaining how the few, that narrow scope of winners, has created a system, a culture where we believe we are voluntarily adopting the philosophy that they want us to adopt, thereby perpetuating the systems that keep the few in power. And before Dr. Towns, you may be more familiar with this. Before Dr. Towns coined the phrase fantastic hegemonic imagination, Dr. King spoke about it. He said, whenever the government provides opportunities in privileges for white people and rich people, they call it subsidized. But when they do it for Negro and poor people, they call it welfare. The fact is that everybody in this country lives on welfare. Suburbia was built with federally subsidized credit, and highways that take our white brothers out to the suburbs were built with federally subsidized money to the tune of 90%. Everybody is on welfare in this country. The problem is that we all too often have socialism for the rich and rugged free enterprise capitalism for the poor. That's the problem, end quote. Dr. King is saying the same thing. He just says it differently than Dr. Towns. You see, in this system, the winners, the few, are noble and nice and polite. Why shouldn't they be? And they shy away from speaking of religion or politics and get into the Pilate-like pose and just wash their hands clean over and over and over again. Now, in our reading today from Genesis, the story of Hagar and Sarah, we often are more acquainted with one perspective of the story. You know, the Abraham and Sarah lineage. Even though right there in Genesis it talks about God looking out for Hagar and Ishmael by providing them a well that would never run dry for sustenance. And we may not know, you may know, but this place in Islam is a sacred place. This is where the Kaaba was built. This is Mecca. This is where Muslims go on pilgrimage, on Hajj. This place where Hagar was banished to is sacred and central. And too often the narratives that we hear is that Islam is anti-woman, when Islam regards a woman and the place she was banished and found a way to survive as their place of holy pilgrimage, one of the pillars of Islam. And if you know some Muslim people, have conversations. You might be surprised that it might not be the way you always thought it was. You know, there are many so-called winners and countless losers. And who is winner and who is loser usually depends on who's telling the story. As humans, our propensity for violence against other humans as a means of survival, it's absolutely confusing to me. I simply do not get it. I simply do not get it. We have this earth. Those of you that are gardeners in Sacramento, how many of you eat everything you grow? You don't eat everything, right? You grow more than you can eat. Yeah, sort of. Most of us in Sacramento, we're not even trying. We're not even trying. Let's talk about tomatoes. Any of you ever given up on a tomato plant and just ignored it and it comes back? The earth just gives us stuff. We don't even have to do anything in so many places, and yet we're fighting people over what? Over what? Now, some say if we're not prepared to defend ourselves, then those that are bent on dominance and have the weapons will wreak havoc on us. Well, I think for a few decades now, it is us who are bent on dominance, and we have the weapons, and we have wreaked havoc all over the globe. But we just keep feeding the beasts of war and have supremacist ideologies, and we have been the winners, so we get to tell the stories and provide justification for why we did what we did. There are many so-called winners and countless losers, when ultimately, I think all we really want is to just be left alone. Not lonely, but left alone to live, to learn, to work, pray, and play in peace. I'm in my mid-50s, and I've agonized over this for a long time. And prayerfully, I hope the rest of the balance of my life can still be measured in estimates of decades rather than days or months. Amen? And day by day, the certainty inside me that I will die wondering why we, the big we, are unwilling to do what it takes for co-flourishing. And it's hard to overcome that despair sometimes. But the wisdom of the ages and ancestors who say, you're not going to see the work completed, child, but neither do you get to stop working for it. People just want to be left alone to live, to learn, to work, to pray and play in peace, to watch and listen as children play and create, to hear the old reminisce and tell stories and laugh under shade trees or porches, to have enough food for nourishment and clean water to drink. There are so many so-called winners and countless losers. Who is winner and who is loser depends on who tells the story. So, tell your story. Tell your story. Do not repeat the stories that fantastic hegemonic imagination demands from you. Tell the stories that you own, the story that is you, your true, glorious, painful, and beautiful story. As an example, when you go to a new social environment, a cocktail party or a mixer or whatever, one of the first things people want to find out about you is what you do for a paycheck. That has nothing to do really with who you are. And yet so much of our identities get wrapped up into this. Who told us that would be or should be so important? Like, where did we get that idea? That our primary identity is connected to how we make money. How many times have you been asked, so what do you do to create art and beauty in the world? You ever been asked that at a mixer or a cocktail party? Well, there's your next question. There's your lead in, and watch what happens. Watch what happens. It will change things. And the person you've asked now has a story to tell you some truth about who they are. And you, in turn, have the opportunity to tell some truth about who you are, the pain and the beauty. And I don't care if it gets uncomfortable. Get uncomfortable. Get uncomfortable. Tell your stories of the desire to live, to learn, to work, to pray and play in peace. And listen deeply when others share their stories with you. And I believe that in doing this, in telling our true stories, that we, the big we, become the real winners. And change is made possible. Amen.